About a month later, King Nahash of Ammon led his army against the Israelite town of Jabesh Gilead. But all the citizens of Jabesh asked for peace. "Make a treaty with us, and we will be your servants," they pleaded. "All right," Nahash said, "but only on one condition. I will gouge out the right eye of every one of you as a disgrace to all Israel." "Give us 7 days to send messengers throughout Israel," replied the elders of Jabesh. "If no one comes to save us, we will agree to your terms." When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and told the people about their plight, everyone broke into tears. Saul had been ploughing in a field with his oxen, and when he returned to town, he asked, "What's the matter? Why is everyone crying?" So they told him about the message from Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came powerfully upon Saul, and he became very angry. He took 2 oxen and cut them into pieces, and sent the messengers to carry them throughout Israel with this message: "This is what will happen to the oxen of anyone who refuses to follow Saul and Samuel into battle." And the Lord made the people afraid of Saul's anger, and all of them came out together as one. When Saul mobilized them at Bezek, he found that there were 300,000 men from Israel and 30,000 men from Judah.
So Saul sent the messengers back to Jabesh Gilead to say, "We will rescue you by noontime tomorrow." There was great joy throughout the town when that message arrived. The men of Jabesh then told their enemies, "Tomorrow we will come out to you, and you can do to us what you wish." But before dawn the next morning, Saul arrived, having divided his army into 3 detachments. He launched a surprise attack against the Ammonites and slaughtered them in the whole morning. The remnant of their army was so badly scattered that no 2 of them were left together. Then the people exclaimed to Samuel, "Now where are those men who said, 'Why should Saul rule over us?' Bring them here, and we will kill them." But Saul replied, "No one will be executed today, for the Lord has rescued Israel." And Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us all go to Gilgal to renew the kingdom." So they all went to Gilgal, and in a solemn ceremony before the Lord, they made Saul king. Then they offered peace offerings to the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites were filled with joy.
But as I was reading this chapter and praying, I do feel God spoke quite personally to me, and I will share it because it might well be relevant for others too. And you know, in some ways, that's what we do as we share what God is saying to us. We offer it, saying, "This is what I think God's saying to me. It might be of relevance to you too." So as I share what I feel God said to me, see whether God wants to speak to you too through it. As I read this chapter, I was reminded of my good friend Steve, who at the moment, I don't meet at the gym. Or should I say rather, I don't meet in the jacuzzi in the steam room and for coffee afterwards because we can't. But Steve runs his own company, recruitment company. And we're often talking about people he's got going for different interviews. And on a number of occasions, he's talked about different approaches that they take to their interviews. And one, which you might have come across, is the STAR method, where when you're asked a question in an interview, You go through the letters of the word star. So you make sure you describe a situation you were faced with. You then explain the task, your role, your responsibilities in that situation. You then explain the action that you took. And then importantly, you explain the results. What were the quantifiable results of your actions? Situation S, task A, T, action A, results R. And as I read through this chapter 11, it felt almost as if this was a bit like a star interview. It's at the end of chapter 10, when Saul had been made king, there had been a number of people who had said, no, we don't like Saul. We don't think he's right for the job. We're going to go off grumbling. And on my first reading through, it felt like this was Saul proving himself. So he recognizes the situation that he's been anointed, but that there are some dissenters in Israel. And then this city of Jabesh Gilead is under siege, on the point of collapse and disgrace. The test was that he's, as the appointed leader of Israel, Saul had a responsibility to call the nation to arms, to lead them into battle, to defeat the Ammonites. So action, what did he do about it? Well, he cut up a pair of oxen, sent the bits of the carcass to all the regions of Israel, threatening them with destruction of their own oxen if they didn't follow him into battle. And then he devised an ambush strategy, led the men in battle. What was the result? Well, the Ammonites were slaughtered. The battle comprehensively won. Saul was affirmed as king with great celebrations. If you were looking to appoint a leader of the nation Israel at this time, well, Saul sets out his star quality. He gets the job. But actually, it's not as simple as that. Because if we read it just like that, we've missed out on God's part in this story. Verse 6, when Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. His anger, his response was as a result of the Holy Spirit coming upon him, causing that response in him. Verse 7, when he took the pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, sent them round, saying, this is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel. Then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. It was the terror of the Lord that fell on the people, or as Lucy read in her version, the Lord made the people afraid of Saul's anger. People responded because God moved their hearts to be afraid. And then verse 13 at the end, when people are saying, hey, let's identify those that didn't want you as King Saul, and we will do away with them. We will execute them. We will get rid of them. Saul says, no one will be put to death today. For this day, the Lord has rescued Israel. Whatever happens later on in Saul's life in terms of following God or not, at this point, he recognized that it was God who won the battle. So actually what we're looking at in 1 Samuel 11 is not so much Saul proving his worth as a leader, but God validating, vindicating Saul's leadership. If I'm honest, I like both of those scenarios. I like the thought of being able to prove my worth, my value, my leadership. I also like the thought that God would validate me, that God would vindicate me in what I do, that God would be the one to tell others of my worth, my value. But God has been challenging me that this is not what I should be seeking. And not just that I shouldn't be seeking it, but that it may never come. Things in life can look like a failure to the world. What I do in life might seem a failure to the world. My ministry can seem to have failed, and yet God could still be pleased. He may judge it a success. See, success and failure are judgments made based on the result of plans you set out. If I plan, or if I go for a walk later today, and if I end up in Hadlow, is that a success? Levi might say yes. Others of you might say no way. Well, it depends. If I planned to end up in Hadlow, it would be a success. If I planned, on the other hand, to end up in Maidstone, well, that would be a failure. If I win £1,000 because I'm the 1,000th person to enter the new Disney store when it opens, have I succeeded? Well, if I've spent time working out the average footfall, the time the shop opened, if I sat watching and counting, then yes, I succeeded in my plan. If I knew nothing of the prize but just happened to enter at the right time, that's not success, that's just fortunate. So, what are my plans? What should all our plans be? Obedience to God in faith. Obedience to God in faith. Do you remember the first and greatest commandment? To love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Love God. The Apostle John writes in his second letter, this is love, that we walk in obedience to his commands. And that obedience must be done in faith, as the writer to the Hebrews reminds us, without faith it's impossible to please God. Obedience to faith, obedience to God in faith. That should be our plan. That's what success or failure rides on. Have we been obedient to God in faith? And only God can really judge whether we're successful in it or not. And he may choose to let others know, but he may not. That writer to the Hebrews carries on in that 11th chapter, detailing people who are noted for their faith. But he ends the chapter with this. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released, so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and ill-treated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. Outwardly, in their lives, you would have said they had failed, yet they were commended for their obedience in faith. As I said last week in my sermon, my prime focus this year is to feed my love for God. That comes first. How do I demonstrate my love for God? This is love, that I walk in obedience to his commands in faith. I'm desperate to see visible signs of his kingdom advancing. I'm desperate to see people come to faith. I'm desperate to see God's power being displayed. But those things are not my goal. Obedience to God in faith is. I may long to prove my worth, show I'm right, vindicate myself as King Saul did. I may wish that God would vindicate me, that God would apply his stamp of approval for others to see, as God did for Saul in this chapter 11. But God is calling us to a life of faithful obedience, obedience to him and his leading. And we leave any approval up to him as he chooses. That's what God's been stirring in me this week as I've been reading that chapter. Seeing Saul, his response, seeing the people validate him, seeing God come and show up and say, yes, Saul's my man. And God saying, obey me. If you love me, obey me in faith and don't worry about what others think, what others will say. Obedience in faith.